December the 1st, 1986. Police in Newtown, Connecticut are informed of a woman who had been missing for the past 2 weeks.
She would never leave her children without saying anything. She'd never just get up and go. She'd always tell her children where she was going.
When police questioned her husband, he claims his wife Helle Crafts has gone back to Denmark to visit her sick mother.
Police discovered that he was giving a lot of different stories to different people about Helle's whereabouts.
A few weeks later, police get information that leads them to start a search along the banks of Lake Zor.
So now they're on their hands and knees and they're looking for a body that would be Helle Crafts.
After a lengthy search, police find only fragments of bone, teeth and hair that they believe to be that of Helle Crafts.
One of those pieces of bone was critical because it was bone from the skull in a location that could only be removed either surgically or by force.
It looks like Helle has been savagely murdered and her body disposed of in a horrendous way. The question is, who did it and why?
Do I think the act is evil? Yes. It was hard to believe that someone could do that to another human being.
(1986) Newtown, Connecticut. On the 1st of December, a private investigator and a young woman go to talk to police about the disappearance of a woman called Helle Crafts.
A gentleman named Keith Mayo, who was a private detective, brought in a young girl who was a nanny for the Crafts and reported that Mrs. Crafts had gone missing before Thanksgiving.
Keith Mayo was adamant that the police open an investigation immediately and look into the disappearance of his client, Helle Crafts.
I asked Mr. Mayo to leave the room so that I could interview the babysitter without anyone helping her with answers. We discussed her not being around for Thanksgiving, and she discussed that there had been arguments going on between Mr. and Mrs. Crafts.
Don Thomas, the Crafts au pair, told police that Richard Crafts, Helle's husband, had said that Helle woke up in the early hours of the morning after there was a huge snowstorm and a power outage and had driven to his sister's in Westport, Connecticut and was going to meet him there, but she never turned up.
Richard Crafts was already known to Newtown police as he'd been volunteering with them for some time.
He was actually an auxiliary police officer, which means he was a volunteer and he worked part-time. But he took the job very seriously.
He would stop by the police department to look at the schedules in case there was church traffic, which is what our auxiliaries did. They also rode alone in a car in pairs, and they would check schools, churches, homes that were vacant because residents were on vacation. And if they came in to ride and there wasn't another auxiliary, they'd ride with a regular officer on the shift.
He had a car, a Crown Victoria car, which is the same car that the Connecticut State Police had, but he had it decked out with all sorts of radios and lights to make it look like he was really one of them.
So they knew him very well and they knew how seriously he took his responsibilities.
Investigators began running standard procedures for a missing persons case, trying to piece together what had happened to Helle.
They were checking credit cards, they were checking the airports, they were making calls to her relatives, doing basic things that you would normally do, trying to see if she'd been spending any money anywhere. And they interviewed Richard.
Richard Crafts said that the night before she'd gone missing, that she was very happy, in a good mood.
Richard told police that she was a little bit tired, she decided to go to bed. There was nothing untoward, there was nothing unusual about her behavior. And then the next morning when they woke up, there was no power in the house. So the plan was that she was going to go to Richard's sister's house in Westport, Connecticut. But he hadn't seen or heard from her since.
He just kept sticking to his story. I don't know where she is. You know, I'm trying to keep this together for the kids. And he had no more explanation than that.
Helle's friends provided police with a strong but worrying indicator that something was not right.
There's one thing that all of them said, and that was she would never leave her children without saying anything. She'd never just get up and go. She'd always tell her children where she was going.
It just made no sense that this woman would leave 3 little kids without telling anybody and just disappearing into the ether.
Helle was born in a small village called Charlottenlund, situated a few kilometers north of Copenhagen, where she grew up an only child.
She was quite a vibrant character. She always had a lot of friends. She loved school. She was gifted with languages. She spoke English and French fluently, and then she understood a number of other languages. She later studied in the UK, and then she worked as an au pair in France.
She was a very attractive girl. She had high cheekbones, long blonde hair.
Helle had a very engaging and warm smile, and she was the kind of person when she walked into a room, she would definitely make heads turn.
Helle decided that she wanted to be a flight attendant, so she started off with Capital Airways, which flew predominantly from Europe to Africa. Then she heard that Pan Am Airways were hiring.
When Helle found out that Pan Am was hiring flight attendants in Copenhagen, she decided to apply, because at the time she was only really flying to Africa and she wanted to do transatlantic flights.
Helle moved to the United States in the late 1960s to further her career as a flight attendant. In 1969, she met and started dating Richard Crafts, a pilot for a regional airline, flying mostly from New York to Miami.
They met poolside in 1969 in Florida, Miami. He was about 10 years older, but he was a pilot.
So Richard Crafts was the youngest of 3. He had 2 sisters, and he came from a very wealthy family that was originally from Manhattan, and they had moved to a very affluent area in Connecticut.
He had spent 1 year at the University of Connecticut. He was there for a year and then left to go join the military.
We had information that Mr. Kraft may have been involved as a pilot during the Vietnam War with the Central Intelligence Agency.
He was piloting for Air America, which was apparently a military CIA operation in Southeast Asia in the early 60s.
So when Helle met Richard, she knew that he was engaged to someone else, but she didn't really care, and the relationship kind of went on and off. Helle's friends didn't really understand what she saw in Richard because he was quite a regular guy and she could probably have anyone she wanted.
In 1975, they married at a small ceremony in New Hampshire. Within a couple of years, they had started a family.
So after they got married, they bought a ranch house in Newtown, Connecticut. She had her first child, then she had 2 other children. And then eventually she returned to her job as a flight attendant and hired an au pair. So Richard was working as an airline pilot still, and between the 2 of them, they made quite a lot of money. Their income jointly was around $125,000, which put them in the top 5% of American earners at the time.
And she would go off on her work and be gone for several days at a time. And he would fly and be gone for several days at a time. And so their coming and going was not unusual.
She had this whole checkerboard of calendars on the refrigerator in the family, in the kitchen. And so she kept track of everybody's whereabouts, managing 3 little kids, husband frequently gone, she's frequently gone. It was, it was a circus act to keep all the balls in the air.
Helle was a very devoted mother, and it was just totally not like her to leave her children without putting things in place. So the family were concerned.
During the early months of 1986, Helle became suspicious that Richard was in a relationship with another woman.
Richard Crafts, her husband, was extremely unfaithful. He was constantly cheating on her, having affairs with countless women.
Maybe she thought that she could change him eventually, but that wasn't the case. His womanizing behaviour continued.
Even though she really wanted the marriage to work, it was just the end of the road.
She contacted a private investigator from New Milford named Keith Mayo. And Mayo conducted an investigation of Richard, and he assembled a fair amount of evidence.
She got surveillance pictures of Mr. Crafts and this other woman in New Jersey.
When she found out that he was having an affair, she just didn't want to be married anymore. She wanted out.
And so she had contacted a divorce lawyer in Danbury, Connecticut, and was contemplating starting a divorce.
They were going through a contentious separation and then divorce. There was a fair amount of tension around the house, but no one really knew, except for this close circle of friends that she had. She wasn't really known to the community at large, because no one knew that what was really going on at the outset of this whole episode.
Mr. Mayo advised me that he had spoke with several friends of Mrs. Crafts who told him that there were domestic problems in the home and that if she had anything ever happened to her, they should look at her husband.
And that was really a warning to everyone that was aware of it. It was kind of shocking.
The last night Helle was seen alive was on the 18th of November, after she had returned from an international flight.
Helle had just come back from a European trip, and she and a co-worker who lived in the vicinity carpooled from Kennedy to her home and was dropped off.
And she said to the girls, the ladies that she was driving with, they were fellow flight attendants, she looked up and she said, "Oh, Richard's home." And that was, as she departed the car and went into the house, that was the last anyone actually heard from her.
This was right before Thanksgiving, so she was at home with her husband, 3 children, and their au pair or nanny who lived with them.
What was to happen next would see the Craft household ripped apart, with secrets and disinformation as to the whereabouts of Helle Crafts. Richard had had numerous romantic affairs, and the situation caused the couple to fight constantly. The night of November the 18th was no different.
So Helle and Richard had quite a tempestuous relationship. It was very up and down. They fought in public. It was far from a smooth relationship.
It's very hard to live your life and fight out in the open when you have a nanny, in the house. And if you're trying to keep the children out of it, you're fighting in the bedroom with a closed door.
On the night of November the 18th, Newtown, Connecticut was hit by a heavy storm, one that knocked out electricity for the whole area.
So when they woke up and there was no power or electricity in the house, she told her husband, apparently, that she was driving to his sister's house.
And he said that he would follow her.
Don Thomas, the Crafts au pair, said that Richard had woken her and the children up very early in the morning and said that they were to go immediately as well.
Richard gets them all up at the crack of dawn and loads them all into his car. Dawn Marie Thomas tells the investigators later that he was frantic to get them out. He's yelling at the kids, "Let's move it, let's move it."
She thought that this was very odd, given the poor visibility with the snowstorm, that they were going out into this huge storm and supposed to drive all the way to Westport. As soon as they got there, she noticed that Helle wasn't there, and then Richard left immediately. Dawn told police that Richard hadn't come back to the house until 7 p.m. that evening. And when Dawn asked Richard the next day where Helle was, he said that she had gone to Denmark to visit her sick mother, and that she wouldn't be back until the 24th of November.
As the days went by and there was no sign of Helle, people started to get a bit suspicious of Richard's stories and began to make their own inquiries. One of these people was Lena Johnson, a good friend of Helle's.
Lena Johnson had heard from the au pair that Helle had gone to Denmark to visit her sick mother. Well, Lena managed to track down her mom's phone number. So she phones up her mom, and her mom is fine. She's not ill at all. She hasn't seen Helle. And if anything, the next time she was supposed to see her was the following April.
Lena Johansson went to the police expressing her concerns, and she also told them about a conversation she had with Helle before she disappeared. And Helle said that if anything happens to me, don't assume that it was an accident.
As police continued to question the Crafts' family and friends, they noticed that Richard was never telling the same story.
We found that we were getting different stories from different people, so it was very hard to pin down exacts.
For instance, he told one person that she had gone to Germany. He told another person that he didn't know where she had gone.
Richard at the time was saying, I don't know where she is. You know, she could be on an island somewhere in the South Pacific, maybe with a boyfriend, who knows?
And then he told the au pair that she had gone to Denmark to take care of her sick mother and that she would arrive back on the 24th of November. But of course, the 24th of November came and went, and Helle was not there. So at this stage, the police are very concerned, and they think that Richard might have something to do with the disappearance of his wife. But there's no direct evidence linking the disappearance of Helle Craft to Richard Craft. It was like she had simply vanished. But there were a portion of the police detectives who were unconvinced and believed that they needed to bring him in for an interview.
Early on in the investigation, they asked him to take a lie detector test in early December.
My lieutenant and one of our detectives had taken Mr. Craft to the polygraph unit of the state police in Meriden. And Mr. Craft was given a polygraph test and he passed.
I think that that's part of his personality, being very much in control of himself. And then he took a second polygraph test and passed that as well.
Police decided to delve into Richard Craft's history prior to Helle's disappearance.
They pulled his phone records and his credit card purchases to see what he was up to. They noticed on his credit card records that he had bought a large high-capacity freezer, and he picked it up just 2 days before Helle went missing. They also noticed another transaction on his credit card.
They found out that there was a $900 bill paid for by his MasterCard for Darien Rentals. Darien Rentals rents out large machinery and equipment.
So the police went to Darien Rentals to figure out what that transaction was on Richard Craft's credit card, and they found out that he had rented a large wood chipper machine.
One of the cops that he worked with saw Richard driving around in the subsequent days with this wood chipper, and he's thinking, this is crazy, why is he doing this? Oh, he said, I've got to cut up some wood because of the storm knocked down a bunch of trees, so I'm cutting them up. That's what I'm doing.
Police now obtained a search warrant for the Crafts' home. On Christmas Day 1986, officers entered the house.
They had learned that Richard Crafts was actually going to Florida for Christmas, so they thought this was the perfect opportunity to go and conduct their investigation.
It was kind of a mess, and things were out of place. Looked like they'd been moved around. You know, clearly Helle had not been there for some time by the time that they went through the whole house, and it was in really disarray.
One area of the home that was somewhat unusual was the master bedroom. And the master bedroom had been in a little bit of disarray when the police first arrived. The carpet had been ripped up from the floor, and there were only small portions of carpet fibers still stuck to the edging. The mattresses had been moved into a different room. So the first thing the police did is try to put things back in the room that were there originally. Once the mattress was put back into the master bedroom, the mattress that was originally there, It was noted that there were reddish-brown blood-like stains on the side of the mattress.
And they had Dr. Henry Lee, who was the director of the Connecticut Forensic Laboratory, come and look at the blood stains, and he determined that they were blood type O, which is a very common blood type. Helle was blood type O, but that, 40% of the world is blood type O, and so it doesn't tell you much.
This was a circumstantial case from the beginning. And now the evidence is beginning to come in bit by bit by bit.
As the investigation continued, word began to spread amongst the local community about Helle's disappearance. Police got a major break when a local man told them of an unusual event he'd witnessed.
One of the town's snowplow operators, Mr. Hine, said that he had seen something really unusual on the road that runs by the banks of the Housatonic River.
The big break was when it just so happens at 4 o'clock in the morning, a snowplow driver from Southbury was driving along River Road, and he sees a truck parked by the side of the road with a wood chipper behind it in tow, shooting wood chips and snow into the water and onto the banks. He pulls around and looks at this guy and says, what is this all about? This guy really needs the wood that bad that he's got to be doing this crazy stuff at 4 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a freak snowstorm? Over time, the word gets back to police from the snowplow driver. So now they have this cosmic moment. The cops, their energy level goes way up. Now all this energy is focused on this wood chipper. They run Richard's credit cards, and they discover that he's rented a wood chipper from Darien Rental, and that he had bought, just prior to that, he had bought a brand new big truck that would be able to haul a heavy-duty industrial strength wood chipper. So they put this all together. Now all of a sudden, they have a crime scene.
With the evidence from the house and the statement from Joseph Hine, the snowplow driver, police moved the investigation to the banks of Lake Sauer.
The cops are flying to the scene in bad weather, driving 90 miles an hour on these back roads in Fairfield County and western Connecticut to get to the scene and establish a crime scene. They erect the tents. They've got heaters. They're melting snow all over the place.
It was very cold, it was rainy, it was snowy. They set up tents on the shore of the river, and they began to dry out the area best they could with portable heaters. And at that time, they found what appeared to be remnants of fingernails, pieces of flesh, and bone.
Dr. Henry Lee was brought in by police to piece together all the evidence that was beginning to accumulate.
Henry was well known within his circle of people as a expert forensic scientist who could develop theories and was a huge resource from the beginning, obviously, on this thing.
Dr. Lee's work was phenomenal. He brought in all of the proper experts. For Connecticut, it was probably way ahead of the times for a state that really didn't deal with a lot of this.
With a team of experts in place, more and more evidence began to emerge. It would eventually point in the direction of the cold-blooded killer of Helle Crafts.
If I recall correctly, the first items they brought was really just a collection of materials that were all collected from the side of the river. So it was a package of wood chips, soil, other material, hair fragments. They wanted to know, was there muscle tissue or bone or other materials that were present?
Some of the pieces of bone, to my amazement, could be identified as part of the human skull, the human parietal bone on the side, and parts of the human hand, and parts of a human foot.
They also find, and this was critical, a bone fragment that was part of the cranium. And that was a decisive factor in that it was used to issue a death certificate, because without this piece of bone, a person couldn't be living. That was the determination of the medical examiner.
You can live a long time without pieces of your skull if they're removed from the outside, but when they go inside into the brain, it kills you. It was broken inward because the inner layer of the bone was bigger than the outer layer of the bone, and so it had been forced into the skull. And it had been chopped in different planes. Something very violent had happened to the bone. It had been cut, chopped, broken in these many different planes.
In order to determine what had happened to the bone fragment, the investigation team decided to run an unusual test involving a dead pig.
In the investigation, there were questions raised. How do you know that these chips of bone that were found are consistent with going through a wood chipper?
No one had ever seen a body that went through a wood chipper. We had to determine whether or not a wood chipper could in fact do such damage.
It was agreed to use the corpse of a baby pig in the experiment. Its skin and muscle closely mirrors that of a human being.
And so they set up a grid with almost looked like a playing field, and they recorded it. They fed the pig through the wood chipper.
We got the suspicious wood chipper and turned on the wood chipper, threw the pig in. Literally 1 second, chopped up the entire pig and spit it out anywhere from about 20 feet to about 60 feet from the mouth of the wood chipper. And we collected all of the pieces and we defleshed what was there. And we had pieces of pig from head to tail.
The anthropologists then compared the chips from the pig to the chips that were found along the river to show they were very similar in size and shape and the effect of going through the cutting blades in the wood chipper.
The pieces that I saw were similarly fractured in multiple angles, in multiple planes, so the bones had gone through some process that had cut them and cut them and cut them again and again. But I was able to identify whole pieces of bone.
As forensic investigators examined the remains from the banks of Lake Zoar, in the lab, other search teams were carrying out intensive searches of the lake.
They were examining further locations along the Housatonic River and Lake Zoar. So they were collecting more samples to bring to the laboratory.
During the process of the investigation, the state police sent in diving teams to look in the river. And near the site, they found a chainsaw.
Located on various parts of the chainsaw, there were deposits. There's a section where the blade attaches to the chainsaw, and there was a lot of debris. Some of it looked like sawdust, wet sawdust, because it had been in the water, but also other materials. We didn't really know what that was. I scraped portions of that, soaked it, extracted it, tested that, and identified human protein in that material.
During further examination of the chainsaw, officers found its serial number had been filed off, making it difficult to identify.
We applied some chemical material to remove the upper surfaces of the metal that were corroded. And in the process, we brought up clearly a serial number.
And once they had the serial number, then they went to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer says, well, that particular chainsaw was shipped to such and such a store. And so they go to that store, and the store owner pulls out all of his credit card receipts, and sure enough, Richard Kraft purchased this particular chainsaw. Yeah, pretty damning evidence. Once they had the fact that Crafts had purchased the chainsaw, then they start working backwards. And he was supposed to have picked up a particular kind of truck, but it wasn't ready for him. And so then he had to rent a bigger truck. And then the credit card receipts also trace him to the wood chipper. And that particular wood chipper had strands of blonde hair in it, so it hadn't been cleaned. And so the wood chipper and Crafts are associated, the chainsaw and Crafts are associated, the truck and Crafts are all associated through his credit card purchases.
Other evidence found along the banks of the river was a tooth crown. This would prove to be crucial to the investigation.
But it was an unusual kind of crown, and Dr. Karazoulis took approximately 2,000 x-rays of this tooth crown.
I was given a gold cap, and after doing the image of the cap, then I knew it was attached to somebody's teeth. All the x-rays from a dentist in the local area where she lives, they gave us 5 or 6 years of x-rays. I measured what the size is in the x-rays of it and matched them to the images in the pictures that he sent me in the x-rays.
Teeth are still used for identification of human remains when they're found. It's very reliable for that purpose. So the examination of the crowns and the tooth and piece of bone that was compared to x-rays from Helle Crafts allowed the medical examiner to associate those materials found together and say, the person who owns this skull bone is dead, and that person is Helle Crafts.
I called Dr. Lee and I told him that the object you sent me belongs to the person whose x-rays you sent me, and there's no question. He says, we're ready to go to court.
With the evidence mounting, police were now able to create a picture of what happened the night Helle Crafts went missing.
She was going to take the children and move to Denmark with her mother. And I believe that there was a domestic fight over that, the divorce, the incident. We knew that Richard had girlfriends. This escalated to the point where Richard lost his temper.
It's very conceivable, perhaps, that he struck her, knocked her out, perhaps maybe killed her, who knows, but it had happened that night.
Clearly she was bleeding in the bedroom. The hypothesis is that he then put her in the freezer and froze her body just to dispose of it temporarily, and then moved his family and the au pair to his sister's house because the power was out.
The theory is that he used the chainsaw to dismember her and then feed her through the wood chipper.
Based upon the fact that he had a wood chipper, and I don't know, perhaps he was just chipping wood on one of his lots and decided, well, this will be a convenient way to get rid of her, but it sounds like that he had some thought process in having the wood chipper there. Clearly he didn't want her body to be found, and so I would take that as guilty knowledge, and that he had planned on this.
Police were now able to make an arrest.
They arrested him on the night of January 12th. He had just returned from a skiing trip up north in Vermont with his children. I had spoken to him earlier in the day, and he sounded exasperated, exhausted, very tense.
Even though police had a ton of evidence, the trial of Richard Crafts did not go as smoothly as they had hoped.
Because of the high publicity, the trial had been moved from Danbury, Connecticut, and they moved it to New London, Connecticut, across the state.
It was April 4th of 1988, and it was a dreary, cold, early spring day, and it was in New London. And Richard was where he would be up to the left-hand corner with his defense table, looking wan, because we hadn't seen him in months. You know, he'd been arrested in January 12th of '87. This is now 15 months later. He had had some court appearances in between, but no one really had seen it. He was being kept in a nearby jail in Montville. He didn't have much reaction to anything. One of the first witnesses, if not the first, was Helle Crafts' mother. And she was on there. He acknowledged her, and she acknowledged him.
During the trial, Richard Crafts appeared emotionless and cold, never showing signs of remorse.
He didn't see any signs of remorse. He sat there quietly. And when I was leaving, he said hello to me. I said hello back, and I left the courtroom. Obviously, if you've killed the mother of your children, put her in a freezer, cut her limbs up with a chainsaw, and fed her through a wood chipper, you're not what I would consider normal. Evil, I think that, you know, a murder in that setting is a crime of passion. It's a domestic issue. It's between people who've in the past loved each other, and, you know, panic sets in.
I usually don't pay very much attention to the defendants, but in this case I was shocked by his behavior. In the course of the trial, I was asked to identify all of the pieces of bone, and for the most part I would open the envelope and there would be a little tiny piece of bone in the envelope, and I'd say this is a small piece of bone, and then the evidence would be passed to the jury and they'd pass it right down, and not much reaction to it. But when it came to her thumb, and I took the thumb out and held it up and said, this is a human thumb. And the jury just went, oh, gasped, okay? And as it was passed to them, they refused to touch it. I mean, they were keeping it at great distance. And the evidence comes around to the jury, to Crafts' table, and Mr. Crafts takes the thumb out, and it's only about a bone about this big, and he starts flipping it and catching it. Finally, the judge looks at this and tells his lawyer that he needs to control his client, and they take it away from him. But his callousness was shocking to me, and that's pretty unusual for me.
After numerous witnesses, the media was informed a key witness would be taking the stand.
2.5 months into this thing, we get word on a June morning, I think it was June 16th, that stay tuned, there's going to be a big witness today, and it was Richard. So he takes the stand, and he insists, he asked straight out by his defense attorney, did you kill your wife? And he said, no, I did not.
After the defense presented all of the evidence, it was left to the jury to come to a verdict.
It was, at the time, and I think it's still the longest jury deliberation in state history, 17 days, day after day after day. And it became clear that it looks like most of the jurors were in the same place except for one. And in this man's mind, he held out and said he didn't believe that Richard did it, because when the mother looked over at Richard, she offered a kind of a pale, wan smile or acknowledgement. And in his mind, on almost the very first witness, on the very first day, said that was it. She never would have smiled at him if she thought that he was guilty.
And so the judge had no choice except to mistry the case. And it's only because of the single juror who refused to participate anymore that the case was mistried. Everybody else was in favor of convicting him.
I mean, it was such a letdown. Everyone was just exhausted and said, are you kidding me? It was a mistrial, a hung jury. We're gonna have to do this again.
The retrial was moved from New London to Norwalk, Connecticut, where a new jury was assembled and the legal teams presented their cases all over again.
Crafts was retried about 18 months later, and that trial was very quick, lasted a very short period of time.
It was the same testimony. I think it was streamlined a little bit, because after going through it once, The prosecutor, I think, decided there were certain things that he did not have to spend as much time on, but other than that, it was pretty much the same.
However, in this case, Crafts' lawyers argued that his testimony in the first case should not be admitted and that he was not going to take the stand again. And they lost that battle. So the jurors heard his voice booming around and echoing around this courthouse chamber, a courtroom, while he's sitting there, and the back and forth between his lawyer and him, and then the state's attorney's lawyer and him reverberated, and they heard again him say, "I didn't do it," against this really kind of compelling and overwhelming.
With the evidence presented once again, it was up to the jury to come to a unanimous verdict on Richard Crafts.
Compared to the first one, the deliberations were 3 days as opposed to 17, and it was unanimous. They were all rock solid in agreement. He got 35 years to life. It was what they say, the way they describe it is, basically a life sentence. So it's 35 to life. And as we sit here, he's been in jail since January of '87 through now 2019. Richard will be 82 in December of this year.
His actions lead me to believe that this is in fact a deliberate, premeditated murder. And his sentence is therefore in my mind a little bit lenient. I would have rather seen an absolute life sentence.
Even though Richard Crafts was tried twice for the murder of his wife Helle, the defense never found out how he actually did it. This left the family in the position where they would always be asking that question.
This was really tragic for the children. I mean, not only did they lose their mother in a horrific death, but they also lost their father. So they were effectively orphans from a very young age.
They lived with their aunt and uncle. I don't believe they've spoken to their father, from what I've read, in a long time.
Over time, the children grew. I think they kind of moved away, drifted away.
It must impact on the children for the rest of their lives. But to have your mother chopped up is something that I would find very, very difficult to live with.
The case against Richard Crafts was one built mostly out of forensic evidence from fragments found along the banks of Lake Soar.
Forensics are pivotal to pretty much solving most cases. Not just like this, but any case.
Forensics were pivotal in helping to identify the victim and provide linkage to various aspects of the case.
It was forensics that proved the case. Given all the other circumstantial things that were going on outside of it, it was, I don't want to say it was at the dawn of that, but clearly it's the ability to discern DNA is far more sophisticated now than it was back then.
With Richard Crafts finally behind bars, the senseless murder of Helle Crafts and the shocking means by which he disposed of her body finally came to an end.
They'd had a fight. She bumped her head. She was unconscious, and he'd called 911, and she had died on the way to the hospital. We wouldn't be talking about this case. The only reason we're talking about this case is because of the way that he dealt with her body.
To do what he was convicted of doing, it takes a unique person, This wasn't a singular act of passion one night and say, now what do I do? His marriage was dissolving and his life was going to change significantly, financially, emotionally, with the kids, his ex-wife to be. And I'm sure that put that all together and it changes you,
I would like to know why, what happened, and then I'd really like to ask how. Really, what did you do? What did we get right? What did we get wrong?
Maybe you can get away with murder, but there's always some evidence of it. And the first piece of evidence is that the person's not there anymore.